do you have to let people in?
No,
Oh, here they come. Here
we
they
already
come.
have some folks in.
There
Yeah,
we go.
welcome. Thank you for joining. My name's Kathy Roberts with the Amplify. We're glad you joined us this afternoon. While we're waiting for others to join in, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat panel. So you'll find that chat icon at the bottom of your screen. If you're not seeing those buttons down there at the bottom, just hover your mouse down there and you'll see them pop up. But let us know, where you're from, what your name is, and where you're from, and then we'll get started here in just a couple minutes. Yep, I see the numbers going up, up, up. It takes everybody just a minute to get logged in. So if you guys will just hang on and we'll get started here.
And I'm having problems making my screen go the right way. I'm not going to touch any buttons, Kathy, till we get going.
You're like me. Oh, back away, right?
That's right.
Okay, for those of you that just joined, we'll start here in just a couple minutes. If you want to find the chat, and feel free to introduce yourself, let us know where you're from. It's always fun to see where everybody's joining from. And then we'll start in just a minute. Okay, it looks like it's kind of slowed down a little bit, Susan. So we'll go ahead and get started. So today's Science of Reading webinar is focused on the difference between analytic and synthetic phonics. And who better to talk about that with us than the host of the Science of Reading podcast, Susan Lambert. Before we turn it over to her, just a couple of housekeeping things. It's going to be recorded. Today's webinar will be recorded, and you should see an email in about 24 hours that will have that recording for you. Feel free to post any questions you have in the Q&A. So if you notice down at the bottom of the screen, you see a chat, but we'd like the questions to go into the Q&A because Susan's going to address those at the end. So that'll make it easy for her if everything's in one place. So those questions can go in there. Anytime one pops into your head, go ahead and pop it in there, and she'll address those at the end. If you would like closed captioning, you can click on that little CC down at the bottom of the screen, and that will start the closed captioning for you. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Susan Lambert. Take it away.
Thanks, Kathy. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining today. You guys are really lucky. I was telling Kathy before we started that this is a brand new presentation, and I put it together just for this, this event today. So I'm really excited to share with you a little bit about the differences between analytic and synthetic phonics. And as you can see, I'm really going to talk to you about the benefits of synthetic phonics. So before we get going though, let me see here. Always have to start with a cartoon, right? It's that time of day, it's that time of year. And so we are going to talk a little bit about this. So here's sort of a task for you afterwards. You can just Google autumn and figure out why is it that the N is silent. And you'll find out some really interesting things about the transition of the English language from Latin and other words that are like that. So I hope this webinar today really interests you to go in and start learning a little bit more about our language as we start talking about it. I also hope that you learn something new about the English language. So this is what we're going to cover today. You'll notice that we're not going to talk about phonics instruction at the end, because we really have to sort of build the case to understand why certain approaches to phonics instruction are more effective. So we're going to talk a little bit about the English writing system. We're going to review the reading frameworks, the science of reading frameworks, and try to hook some of that to those frameworks. We're going to talk about then language development and the alphabetic principle, which will then lead us to phonics instruction. Before we get started, though, I want to remind everybody that we're talking phonics instruction and not a comprehensive English language arts instruction in your classroom. So I often get worried when folks hear great presentations about phonological awareness and phonemic awareness, about phonics, about writing, about comprehension, ideas for comprehension, remember that we want to make sure that kids have exposure to a whole range of things, which is why I want to talk a little bit about the frameworks and then just remind folks that phonics is just a piece of that instruction. So many of you may know Mark Seidenberg's work. He wrote the really famous popular book, Language at the Speed of Sight. And the thing that he talks about in there is the writing system is what he believes the greatest technology, the greatest thing ever invented. Because the first thing that happened to reading is actually writing. And if you think about that, right, we teach writing, we teach reading, but the gateway into reading is really understanding writing. And so that's why we're going to ground ourselves in orthographies or writing systems. Now we're going to come back to this and hang with me a little bit, but we're going to sort of build this case to really understand why it's not just so easy to say, which is better, synthetic or analytic phonics? Because in order to really do a good job of understanding that, you have to understand the writing system and where we start from. So there's different kinds of writing systems. In English, we use an alphabetic writing system. Other languages that we know, Spanish is an alphabetic writing system. And really an alphabetic writing system means that we have symbols that represent sounds. There's no reason why this letter right here makes the B sound other than it's just been historic, right? It's just developed over time. We could have a different symbol that represented that sound. But for us here in English, we know that these are the letters that we use or the symbols that we use to represent sounds. If you're learning in a different kind of language, symbols actually don't represent sounds in a syllabary, they actually represent syllables. So it's a different sort of approach. And so we want to sort of focus our efforts here on what happens in an alphabetic writing system. Well, we also know that alphabetic writing systems have more or less transparency. What do I mean by transparency? I mean, there are some languages where there are much fewer sounds. So Spanish, for example, Spanish is what we call a pretty transparent language where each vowel only represents one vowel sound. So it's pretty easy to learn once you actually learn the relationship between the symbols or the letters and the sounds that they make in that particular language. English, on the other hand, is not very transparent. As a matter of fact, we call it a rather opaque language because there is actually 44 phonemes, and we're going to talk about the number of letters and letter combinations that represent those phonemes. So it ends up being quite complex. And so it's a thing that, here in the United States, we talk about it, we know about it, we know it's a pretty complex language to learn how to read, but we're going to look at some strategies that actually help with that. There's a little bit of a myth that English is highly unpredictable. And what we actually know is that's not true. It's just if you know the sort of the keys to unlock that code, it's pretty predictable actually. And you can see here that there's only 4% that's really oddities. That's unpredictable because 50% of most common English vocabulary words can be spelled or known if you know the sound letter correspondence. If you have strong sound letter correspondence, 36 more of them can be spelled with just one error. And if you know word origin and where these words come from, like the word autumn, what's the origin of that? 10% more of those can really be spelled accurately just knowing that word or origin. So even though English is quite opaque or complicated to learn, and there's sort of layers within our language, it's still pretty predictable if you understand and know the rules of predictability. So let's sort of hold all that, right? This idea that it's an alphabetic language, that we have symbols that represent sounds, and that it's pretty predictable if we sort of know that. hold that aside for a minute. Let's go to some of our reading frameworks and review some of those. We're going to make a connection between these two things. So we talk a lot about the science of reading and the simple view of reading, right? So most folks that are talking about the science of reading, we're really building on this framework of simple view of reading. And the simple view of reading tells us that skilled reading is a product of two things. It's a product of language comprehension and word recognition. Now, science of reading proponents get a bad rap sometimes because people say, oh, you science of reading people, all you care about is phonics, which we are going to talk about today, but that's not the only thing we care about. Just like Goff and Tumner, who actually created this framework, said, nobody actually believes that decoding equals reading, because to lift the words off the page or to decode them, you actually have to understand what the word means if you're going to get to skilled reading or reading comprehension. So we're going to hold this hold this in our mind too, that what we're talking about here when we get to phonics does sort of sit in that word recognition bucket, but it's also connected to language comprehension in some ways. So reading or the process of acquiring literacy is really not natural, and it's not necessarily a simple process, even though we can represent it with that simple view of reading framework. We're not going to talk about this today, but it truly is a restructuring of your brain. Your brain has to rewire itself to go from the back of the brain to the front of the brain, to map things in your brain that didn't naturally evolve for us to be readers. And so literacy or reading and writing is really an unnatural task. And so we have to do something to actually learn it. So back to our framework, let's talk about language comprehension. This develops naturally. This is making meaning from what you hear. And so when kids come to us in preschool and in kindergarten and start their schooling experience, they're bringing with them language comprehension, right? All the things that they hear and they talk about. It's the ability to carry on a conversation, to talk deeply about a topic, to have vocabulary. And really what we find is that measures of oral language are really good at predicting whether a kid can read words or their reading comprehension level. So the better oral language development kids have and continue to develop, the better readers they become. Now think about that, right? Hearing and talking, word recognition, hearing and talking, language comprehension, they're all going to relate to each other. And we're going to talk about that. When kids come to school, they come to school knowing how to hear sounds. We have to develop some of that, but they come hearing sounds. What about word recognition? This part that we're going to talk about deeply, like this phonics part. Well, word recognition is all about recognizing those words on the page, and that's not a natural process. I can't put a kid in a room with books and adults looking at books and reading books and modeling the reading and expect them to become a fluent reader. We actually have to teach that, and there's really strong evidence that if you are a fluent word reader, or if you can recognize word reads, it's really important for reading comprehension. As a matter of fact, the correlation between the two is pretty high. So this is the thing that has to be taught. And reminder, this framework of Scarborough's reading rope actually shows us there on the top that language comprehension element, right? What's all involved in that, and the word recognition side. We're going to focus on the word recognition side, but like I said, there are links that we have to make to what kids or what we hear and talk about in our oral language development. All right, so here's a new framework. If you've sort of followed along with some of the science of reading webinars that we've done here at Amplify, you may already know about this, particularly if you have been involved in letters training at all, right? So this is Carol Tolman's Hourglass. And I love this because it really helps us connect oral language with orthography, or those words represented in print. And it demonstrates a bit about the progression that kids go through in order to learn how to read or need to go through. So this top part remember, this is all going to be in the oral environment. Phonological awareness is all about hearing and talking. And it's really important that we develop that oral language in kids, and that we start to do things like syllables. Kids get syllables pretty early on. By the time they come to us in pre-K and kindergarten, they pretty much have that. They have alliteration, meaning they can say Sally sat or Sally saw seashells, right? So they can hear those beginning sounds. And they're starting to get the idea of onset and rhyme, which is rhyming words, right? So playing with words, hearing the sounds. And then we move them into sort of blending things together, and really advanced phonological awareness, we call phonemic awareness, is this idea that you can identify sounds in words. So if I said the word cat, you could recognize k, at, right? And if I said mat, at, change the a to eh. Really advanced phonemic awareness knows or can recognize that we can go from mat and change that medial sound to met. And we know that if kids can do that, they are really going to pick up that reading really easily because they have really strong phonemic awareness. Now, kids also then have to go to connecting these sounds and letters to what we call a one-to-one correspondence. When I start to connect with the letter M, right? And a with the letter A and t with the letter T, all of a sudden, I cannot just say mat or segment at, but what I can do is read it. And so that's what we want to do, is develop that one-to-one connection. And you'll notice here that, we sort of go through teaching kids that one-to-one correspondence in what we call basic code, all the way up to advanced code, and even moving into morphology, because morphology is going to be an important part of what we develop then in this process. Okay, wow, it's not wanting to advance for me. I don't know why. There we go. Okay, the alphabetic principle here. Let's revisit this simple view of reading. We talked about that, remember that center part of the hourglass, that little tiny piece that we have to push all the way through in order to open up all the rest of this orthography or the writing system. We can sort of think about this alphabetic principle as the multiplier between language comprehension and word recognition. What's on the language comprehension side? Sounds, right? Kids have sounds. They come knowing words. They come with that understanding that there's sounds in our language. What we need to do is help them connect that then to letters. And so I'm thinking about this a little bit, that really the alphabetic principle is that a multiplier effect that helps us see letters and letter patterns that represent the sounds of language. Reprise on the writing systems. Remember, our alphabetic language, symbols represent sounds. So it represents a really small part of the word. Each symbol represents that small part. Our symbols do not represent syllables or parts of words. They represent individual sounds. And that's going to be important when we start to talk about the differences then between synthetic phonics and analytic phonics. One more word about this alphabetic principle, because we've been talking about it in the context of reading words. But if you go and look at really the two elements of the alphabetic principle, we have element one, which is alphabetic understanding. We talked about that. Words are composed of letters that represent sounds, or combinations of letters that represent sound. But there's also this thing called phonological recoding. Good grief, what is that? Well, phonological, you follow the track here, that has to do with phonological awareness, phonemic awareness. It has to do with awareness of sounds. And what we need to do is pull into our working memory what we know about the letter sound correspondence to be able to decode words that we don't know and to spell words. And we're going to find out that one of the benefits of synthetic phonics is we actually approach it at the very small sound level, and it actually helps kids learn how to spell even better. Now, I would venture to guess that none of you have had to decode any of the words on any of the slides, right? The reason for that is because you have become quite automatic in your word recognition. And that automaticity is where we need kids to get to so they can be very strategic when they're reading text, and their cognitive energy does not have to go to recognizing the words or sounding out the words. And there's really a progression that we want to see them go through in terms of word reading. And this is what skilled readers do, right? This is how to develop an efficient brain in terms of skilled reading. So you start by sounding out each individual sound. Think of k, at. And then what we want to do is we want to say each individual sound and blend those sounds together into a word. And then kids will get to the stage where they'll see the word and they might have to sound it out in their head, or, sound it out again, and then say the whole word. And then after they've had so many exposures, what they're going to do is get to automatic word reading. And that's where we want kids to get to. That's where we are. Things are automatic. When things are automatic in our brains, that means we can do them without having to think. And like I said, you recognize all the words on this slide. Once you see those words, you can't unsee them. And that's the automaticity that we want to get to. Okay, so there's two things that we want to unpack here before we get to this idea of how to best instruct kids. We want to talk a little bit about the phoneme, and then we want to talk a little bit more about phonemic awareness. What do I mean when I say phoneme? Well, phoneme is really the smallest unit of speech, or an individual sound of speech. So if you think about the word cat, there are 3 phonemes in that word, k, at. That smallest speech sound is the thing we need to teach kids. And like we said, in English, we're based on phonemes because we're an alphabetic language, right? The letters in our alphabet represent individual sounds. And there's actually 44 phonemes, or 44 individual sounds. The problem with English is there's lots of different ways to represent that sound. So if you think of the letter S or the sound S, right? The letter S actually could, in the word cats, the letter S makes a Z sound, right? So there's a lot of different ways that we represent those sounds with different letters. And that's sort of a condition of the way English sort of developed. But we have to get kids those letter combinations so they can understand how that works. Those have to be explicitly taught, those phonemes. And we also have this thing called phonemic awareness that we were talking about. Now, phonemic awareness sits underneath the umbrella of phonological awareness. Phonological awareness is a whole umbrella of ways that we think about words and sounds. So within phonological awareness is this idea that within sentences, we have words. And then within words, we have different parts of words. But the most important piece we need to get kids to as they're learning how to read is the phoneme level, thus the word phonemic awareness. So we want to get kids at that individual sound level. So phonemic awareness is really essential to learning to read in any alphabetic system, not just English, but any other alphabetic language. It takes more time in alphabetic languages like English that are more complicated, less time in alphabetic languages like Spanish that are not as complicated, but it's really fundamental to mapping sounds to print. And as a matter of fact, phonemic awareness is highly predictive of later reading success. And I want you to look at that word again. This isn't just a correlation. A correlation means like when one thing happens, another thing tends to happen, but we don't know as a cause or effect. Phonemic awareness is actually predictive, which means if kids can isolate sounds, if they can manipulate sounds, both at the beginning, the end, and the middle of words, there's a really good chance that they're going to be really good readers later on. And so it's a strategy we can employ that actually helps successful readers grow. So we're going to take this idea of phonemes, we're going to take this idea of phonemic awareness, and we're going to put it inside this umbrella of phonics instruction. All right, so what exactly is phonics instruction? It's really a way of teaching reading that emphasizes letter-sound correspondence and how they're used in both reading and spelling. This definition has been around for a while. Think about this: letter-sound correspondences, k, at, what letters correspond with the sounds that you hear. And that, when you know that, is going to help you read the word and spell the word, because you'll be able to then pull that word apart. You can blend it together, k, at, cat, and you can pull that word apart, cat, k, at, to both read and then spell. So what did the National Reading Panel say about phonics and phonics instruction? And it's important that we go back there. We reference the National Reading Panel a lot, and we're going to look at, they even had something to say about the kind of phonics instruction you should use. So they talk a lot about systematic and explicit phonics. And so what they say is systematic phonics programs have a planned sequential set. They teach them explicitly and they teach them systematically. All right, what do all those words mean? You probably have heard teaching phonics. Systematic and explicit are two words that really, really are important. Let's talk about the systematic part first. Systematic essentially means you have a scope and sequence. That scope and sequence builds from the simplest concepts to the more difficult concepts. And that scope and sequence is something that cuts across grade levels. So as a kindergarten teacher, you know what you're supposed to be teaching in that grade. Grade 1 teachers know what kindergarten, when the kids come to them from kindergarten, they know what those kids should have been taught, right? They may not have learned it yet, but they know they had instruction in those things. So the first grade teacher can intervene if needed to close their gap or continue on in that grade level instruction. So it's really important when you're thinking about phonics. Do we have a scope and sequence that we actually follow to give all kids access to that instruction that they need to have? What does it mean to teach the elements explicitly? Well, explicit instruction is that thing that leaves nothing to chance. If you want the kids to know it, you teach it to them and you help them practice it. And so Anita Archer's work fits nicely in here. Really explicit instruction is really important. So the National Reading Panel, did a meta-analysis of a whole bunch of studies, and what did they find? And they found these 4 key things. Number 1, this systematic phonics instruction is significantly more effective than non-phonics. So remember what we said about phonics instruction, letters sound correspondence, but phonics instruction is a way to teach kids how to read. Hands down, the National Reading Panel said, this is the way to teach kids to prevent reading difficulties, right? Prevention, number 1 thing. Systematic phonics also boosted growth in reading comprehension. Let me say that again. It boosted growth in reading comprehension. Remember the simple view of reading? Language comprehension, word recognition, Scarborough's rope, they were sort of separated. Here's the thing. If you can't read the words on the page, you can't get to reading comprehension. And so we know phonics instruction is a big indicator of how well kids can do in reading comprehension. And systematic phonics also produced growth in spelling. Remember what I said about the word cat? If I know how to deconstruct that word into its sound parts, k, at, I can spell that word, right? I can represent that word on paper. And really, systematic phonics instruction helped kids at all SES levels make greater gains in reading. So it is effective for all students, keeps kids from being at risk and needing intervention. It helps with their reading comprehension. It helps with their spelling, which also helps then with their later writing, right? So you can see the National Reading Planner outlined all of these things, and there's continuing to be research done that actually continues to build on this work to say, yep, all these things happen when we get systematic phonics instruction. Here's the thing now, finally getting to the reason that you came to this webinar, right? You're probably thinking, wow, that took a long time. But remember, we have to go all the way back to understand our writing system, because our writing system is based on individual sounds that are represented by letters. So what's analytic and what's synthetic? Let's unpack it a little bit. Analyze. What do you do when you analyze something? When you analyze something, you break it apart from the top down. So you separate things into parts and you discover something through detailed examination, and you're really exploring structure. We'll come back to that in just a minute. When you synthesize something, you're really building from the bottom up. You form things by combining parts together to make a coherent whole. So you're really making something. So if we think about this, and we're going to look at this in the next few slides, we don't want kids to have to discover something through examination when it comes to phonics or word recognition. We can have them discover other things in other contexts, like discovery learning in science, but when it comes to unlocking the code of English, we need to just tell them how to do it, have them practice, so they can actually put their cognitive energy into something better, like becoming confident and capable readers to be able to enjoy texts that they interact with, to discover something in the language of the text or the story of the text, right? So that discovery doesn't mean that we're never going to do that in our teaching and learning. It's just not in our phonics. Building up from the bottom, so synthesizing. Think about this. Remember I said alphabetic language. Each symbol represents a sound or combination of sounds. We wanted kids to put things together so that they can form a coherent whole, so they understand how that works. And so now we're starting to form the basis of the difference between analytic and synthetic phonics. So analytic phonics then, as you can guess, is a whole to a part approach. The emphasis at the beginning is really the initial sound. Do you remember when we were looking at Tolman's hourglass? And I said, by the time the kids come to us in pre-K or K, they're pretty good at alliteration and understanding how to hear those initial sounds. Initial sounds are the easiest things for kids to map. So when we do an emphasis on the initial sounds, we're pointing out and helping kids see that initial sound, which is great. The problem with analytic phonics is it puts it into word families. And so we end up helping kids maybe guess at words, right? Like, look at this word family list here. These are all the "and" words: pan, fan, man, can, tan. You put those words in a different context. If we haven't taught kids how to sound all the way through them, then we're working on associations or guessing. And we don't want to do that when it comes to developing automaticity and word recognition. And typically what happens in analytic phonics is spelling instruction is actually addressed separately. So we're working on word families and word family lists. And we do spelling a little bit separately. Now, this isn't true of all analytic phonics programs, but remember, analytic phonics comes from a whole word approach and then starts to break that down. Most analytic phonics programs that I have seen actually don't pay attention to all the sounds within the words and how those sounds work differently. Because what you'll find in English is that those initial sounds are pretty easy to learn, like I said, and those letters and initial sounds function pretty similarly across all words. The problem comes is when you introduce different sounds or letters and letter combinations within words, and when kids aren't aware of those combinations and how to really apply them in words, that's where their reading really breaks down. All right, let's move to synthetic phonics. So what would that look like if you're using a synthetic phonics approach? Well, this again is that part to whole. So what we're going to do is we're going to make an emphasis on every sound in every position. So you can see this lesson is likely about the double E spelling of the long E sound, right? And so what kids do in synthetic phonics is pay attention to beginning, middle, end sounds. If you heard me at the beginning of the webinar, those medial sounds or the in-between sounds are the hardest things for kids to work with and manipulate. So we need to really explicitly help focus on those. And a synthetic phonics approach will help kids sound through an entire word. So we're not going to start at the beginning and then guess the rest of the word. We're actually going to apply those sound spelling patterns to be able to decode through the entire word. This is hard work to develop. And the thing about it is, remember, what we're doing is we're wiring our brain in that reading process. We're literally connecting dendrites in the back or the visual word form area to the middle section of our brain on our left hemisphere that holds the speech center. So back to that simple view of reading, language comprehension, word recognition, we're actually mapping back and forth in our brain and building a muscle or building a wiring system that we weren't born with. And so it is hard work, but the hard work pays off, right? I like to use the example of my brother when he was learning to drive a car. And the reason I can use him as an example is because he would never be listening to one of my webinars. But my parents had a standard transmission, so we both had to learn on a stick shift. And he wasn't very good at it. And after a while, I couldn't ride along with him because it made me really frustrated. Because whenever he would get to a stop sign, it happened to be on a hill, he couldn't get it in gear, the car would end up rolling backwards. And then the whole thing would, what happens, you let the clutch out and the car dies, you got to start it again. And when you're in the middle of traffic and you're flustered like that, you get tense and frustrated. And so it didn't turn out well. He had to work really hard at learning that. Guess what? His hobby was racing cars for a while. He got really, really good at learning how to use that. It came a little easier to me. I never had the desire to race cars. So the metaphor doesn't quite hold, but it's the same idea, is that once you build a muscle, your muscle is strong and it's secure and it's there. And that's what helps kids with the automaticity. So we're going to come back to that in just a minute. So we've talked about analytic phonics, the approach that starts from the whole word, pays more attention to the beginning parts of the word, and then sort of builds associations. Synthetic phonics, which is a part to whole. So we're going to start with sounds and build those sounds up to make words. You probably are wondering, I wonder about decodable text, because decodable text is a hot topic, right? All over the country. I watch my social media and people are saying decodable texts are great. Where can I buy decodable text? I need more decodable text in my classroom because I only have a few. Where can I get them? Here's the thing about decodable text. They're great if the decodable part of them is actually matched to your scope and sequence. So going back to the idea of a systematic approach where you start from the most simple and build to the most complex topics, the same has to happen. So as you're introducing sound spelling patterns in your classroom, a decodable text that actually reflects that scope and sequence is the thing that you're going to have to use to help the kids practice. And decodable texts don't have to be kill and drill boring, right? None of this has to be kill and drill boring. There's really good quality decodable texts out there, but again, make sure that someplace this particular text comes from the Core Knowledge Language Arts program, and this decodables in this program, each one of them shows at the back of the book the code that's assumed at the beginning. So the kids should know these sound spelling patterns, and the code that's actually introduced throughout each one of the reader. So that's what you want to do. You want to make sure that your decodable reader is actually matching your sequence of instruction to help support the kids in terms of their practice. Now, the National Reading Panel actually had something to say about analytic and synthetic phonics. Now remember, this was in the year 2000. And they saw that in their meta-analysis, that actually the effect size for synthetic phonics programs was larger than for larger unit programs and other miscellaneous programs. But they really drew the conclusion that like the synthetic phonics programs weren't showing that much more effect. And so they said they appear to not differ significantly from each other in their effectiveness. But look what it said, although more evidence is needed to verify the reliability of effect sizes for each program. It's this really bolded emphasis that I added on this quote. Now, this comes right from the National Reading Panel report to say that it's now the year 2020. And there's been more work done on both understanding different approaches and their impact on students, as well as going back to reanalyzing some of the meta-analysis that were done in the National Reading Panel. And so we have a little bit more information than we did in the year 2000. And so I'm going to walk through this, but I want to tell you down here at the bottom, there is a link, and these data actually comes from Susan Brady's perspective on research finding on alphabetics and what that means for instruction. And this is actually posted on the Reading League website. So you can go to the readingleague.org and actually find this longer article. It was originally published as a shorter version last year, September, October 2020 issue. So if you're a member of the Reading League, which I would highly recommend that you become one, this will be in your Reading League journal from last year in the fall. But here's what Susan Brady found in terms of looking over a variety of studies. First of all, kids that were taught with a synthetic phonics approach showed gains in word reading across grades. And those gains got larger as the kids went on. So this was a longitudinal study. And they found that in grade 1, the effect size was 0.36, and in grade 2, the effect size was 0.45. So there's lasting impacts in terms of word reading across grades. That's important because when we talk then about kids having access to more text complexity, getting into more text, right, gaining more meaning from text, this synthetic phonics approach actually helps them engage in that text. The second thing she found from some of these studies is that students that were taught with a synthetic phonics approach outperformed those that were taught analytics in 3 different areas: word reading, spelling, and reading comprehension. Remember, we talked about all that word reading and spelling are connected. We should be teaching those things in tandem. And we also talked about how this has an impact then on reading comprehension. And so they actually outperformed those kids, again, in a longitudinal study. We also know that kids that are taught with a synthetic phonics approach actually developed more advanced code skills. What in the world does that mean? That means things like diphthongs or things like ng, sounds that are more advanced code topics and how to represent them. Kids could actually approach more complex words better when they've been taught within synthetic phonics approach. And they demonstrated kids higher reading and spelling outcomes than whole language instruction, which again is not necessarily focused on phonics, except phonics in the moment when it makes sense within the text. So these are just really some exciting new gains in terms of the approach to synthetic phonics that we're seeing. And so hopefully I've pointed you in some good direction to help you understand a little bit about the differences. Couple of resources I want to share with you, and then I'll pop off and take some questions. One is, I really encourage you to go to this website. I think Kathy's going to put this in the chat if she hasn't already. scienceofreading.amplify.com. This is a free website available for you. Lots of resources there already. We continue to add resources to it to really help you understand how to make the shift to more science of reading based practices. And then, of course, follow along on the podcast. We have lots of different topics. We have not yet done one on synthetic versus analytic phonics, but it's on my list to try to do. I'll tell you, not a lot of people are super interested in the details of why synthetics is a better approach, but watch for more information to come there. And again, we've just had some really great episodes. I am going to stop sharing my screen and go in and see if we have any questions. And it looks like there aren't any questions right now. You are going to be receiving a recording of this webinar, so you can go back and re-listen. You can pull some of those research quotations if you need to. I'm just wondering, I'm going to pop in the chat box too here, Kathy, and see if there happens to be any more. All right. Well, if you don't have any more questions, Kathy and I are going to say thank you very much for joining us. Be on the lookout for more information to be posted on our website. And again, the recording of this will come to you in an email. So thank you very much and have a great evening.